Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our webinar today. We're really looking forward to this conversation. I'm Elise Aguilar. I am Federal Policy Counsel here at Americans United for Separation of Church and State. Americans United is also the co-chair of NCPE, which is the National Coalition for Public Education. NCPE is a coalition of more than 50 national organizations that support public schools and oppose private school vouchers. From education groups to civil rights groups to religious groups, we all believe that public money should fund public schools. Today, I'm joined by some of my colleagues from NCPE to talk about private school vouchers and how voucher programs divert resources away from our public schools, which welcome all students, to fund private schools, schools which often discriminate against students and families and fail to provide students with the same civil rights protections they would have in public schools. This webinar today is part of a series that we've put together in conjunction with the creation of a toolkit. And it's really designed to highlight the importance of supporting public education and opposing private school vouchers from different perspectives. I want to briefly share a little bit more information about the toolkit that I just mentioned, and then we'll begin our panel discussion. So this NCPE toolkit is created to be a resource for advocates and legislators in states that are fighting against private school voucher legislation there. Inside the toolkit, there's information about the Supreme Court's recent decision in Espinoza versus Montana Department of Revenue, a decision that undermines states' abilities to prevent funding of private religious schools through voucher programs. And this information will tell more about the decision and what it means for state voucher programs across the country. Inside the toolkit, there are also talking points to help you oppose voucher bills. There are talking points specifically about how to oppose pandemic relief funding for vouchers. There is an explanation of the most common pitfalls in fighting voucher legislation. And there's also a list of referendum that demonstrates how unpopular voucher programs really are with voters across the country. We hope this toolkit will be a valuable resource to you, whether you're an advocate seeking materials to oppose a voucher bill in your state, or if you just simply want to learn more about the issue. And I'm going to quickly share my screen so that I can show you how to access the toolkit should you want to. So let me do that quickly. Here you can see on the NCPE website, we have numerous resources and information available. We also have a whole page dedicated to the toolkit. So you can see there are places to download the toolkit. You can request hard copies of the toolkit if you are an advocate in a state and think it would be helpful to send to legislators or other allies in that state, or if you just know of a great place to send those hard copies, please request those there. If you have questions you want to ask or want more information, we can provide that. You can also see on this page, we have links to the other webinars that I mentioned that have been part of the series we've put on, and they really cover all aspects of why we should oppose private school vouchers, and we hope that you'll find those useful. So now, without any further delay, I'm going to introduce our panelists today. So first we have Myrna Manowitz. Myrna is president of MRM Associates and serves as legislative consultant to the Council of Administrators of Special Education. She has worked in Washington for close to 30 years as a consultant and lobbyist on special and general education policy and legislation. Myrna is former president of the Committee for Education Funding and former co-chair of the National Alliance of Specialized Instructional Support Personnel. Myrna has spent 14 years as a classroom teacher and assisted in the development of Virginia's program for infants and toddlers with disabilities. Next, we have Titilayo Tinubu Ali. Titilayo is Senior Director of Research and Policy for the Southern Education Foundation, where she manages the development of SEF's research-informed policy position and advocates initiatives that strengthen educational opportunities for African American and low-income students across the South. Titilayo previously served as senior researcher and policy analyst and as a consultant at the Learning Policy Institute. She is co-author of On the Road to High Quality Early Learning, Changing Children's Lives, and co-author of the forthcoming book, Great Expectations, Getting School Reform Right, which highlights successful district-wide efforts to build equitable public education systems in Tulsa, Oklahoma, Roanoke, Virginia, and Union City, New Jersey. Next, we have Aaron Ridings. Aaron is the Director of Public Policy and Interim Chief of Staff at GLSEN, a national organization that focuses on LGBTQ+ issues in K-12 education. He has over 15 years of public policy and political experience in federal, state, city, county, school district, and tribal governments. Aaron previously worked for LGBTQ Progress at the Center for American Progress and has had stints working for U.S. Representative Sharice Davids and Washington, D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser. Aaron was the former co-chair of Oregon Safe Schools and Communities Coalition and active with the National Safe Schools Roundtable and the Schools Uniting Neighborhoods program in the Portland, Oregon metro region. And finally, we have our moderator today, Jennifer Berkshire. Jennifer is co-author of A Wolf at the Schoolhouse Door, The Dismantling of Public Education and the Future of School. She writes about education and politics for the nation, the New Republic, the Baffler, the New York Times, and other publications. So now I'm going to turn this over to you, Jennifer, and let you start our conversation.
Thank you so much, Elise. I am thrilled to get to be part of this event and to be in a Zoom room with so many deeply knowledgeable people. We probably don't need to tell people who are in the audience today that the speed with which these often sweeping voucher proposals are coming down the pike is really something to behold. Something like 23 states have now introduced legislation that either expands voucher programs or is introducing, sweeping new ones. And one of the challenges that we're really having is how to quickly bring people up to speed on the dangers that these kinds of programs represent to our students in public schools now and to various sorts of students who are already vulnerable and who are often being singled out as the beneficiaries of these programs. So Titilayo, I would like to start with you. One of the strangest things about our present moment is that these programs are being presented as a kind of disruptive innovation, right? The sort of, the cool new thing from Silicon Valley. But we need you to bring us up to speed on the history of these programs. I think knowing where they came from in the past can really help us start to see through some of the sophisticated ad campaigns that we're hearing so much about right now.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jennifer. And thank you, Elise and AU, for having me here. It's great to be on this panel. So yes, as Jennifer alluded to, it's important to understand how we got here so that we can really give context to what's happening and make better policy and practice solutions in light of that context. So as many of you know, there was a landmark decision, Brown versus Board of Education. And what's discussed a little bit less is what the backlash to that looked like from a policy perspective. We see, the picket signs, and we know how there was, white parents didn't want Black students in their schools. We know that there was, community resistance, but there was policy resistance at the state level that we really need to talk about so that we understand how this and can really see vouchers as a newer version of this. So after Brown v. Board of Education, which some say didn't have enough teeth initially, right? Many Southern states responded. So in history, we often see progress, backlash, right? We just had, some backlash recently in January. So what a lot of Southern states did, instead of moving forward with integrating schools, they chose to just close schools altogether. And you had some individual schools closing, but then you also had really bold moves, like in Prince Edward County, Virginia, where they put chains on the doors and closed the entire school district. What happened after that was that you saw white parents receive vouchers to attend private schools, which were then called segregation academies, and Black parents didn't receive those same resources for their students. What you saw was when they had schools closed, you had really, brave teachers and principals who were then out of jobs, still holding these one-room schools and pulling together their resources to continue to educate their communities. But there was this policy perpetuation of segregation through the closing of schools and through the provision of what were essentially vouchers to white parents to attend private schools as a resistance to that integration. So no matter what you call it, you see vouchers, you see tax credit scholarships, all of these programs have that same origination and that same sort of economic function, whether it's tax credit scholarships, vouchers, ESAs, which are education savings accounts. They all divert public resources out of public schools and into private schools. And as Elise mentioned earlier, because private schools don't have to comply to a lot of the same very rigorous civil rights requirements that public schools do to protect kids, you see the perpetuation of discrimination, and even research has shown that segregation perpetuates when these vouchers are available. I think we'll talk more about how the research has shown that students don't fare any better in these situations when they use them, and sometimes they fare worse. But just to sort of recenter and ground us and why we even care about this, we have 50 million students in public schools in this country. Half of those students are students from lower income families. Half of those students are students of color, and we have many immigrant students as well. Public schools are where the majority of our students are being served, and our focus should really be on creating a quality system of public schools that serve those students well, instead of taking resources away from those public schools, particularly in communities that are already facing disinvestment and have already experienced the results of systemic racism in their communities. So they're left with oversized classrooms, high teacher ratios, outdated materials, and a number of things when we continue to draw resources out that way. We have seen many great examples of excellent public schools, and many public schools are doing a great job with what they have. I've written about some of them, I've done research on them, and they exist without robust choice systems in them. They really do that hard, boring work of looking at what's needed to create a quality experience for the child and providing resources to do that. So we advance policy solutions that are make it clear that we shouldn't be making decisions about that smaller sort of minority of people. And we'll talk more about the costs later and how whether or not vouchers even make private schools available to people and who they make them available to. But we really just need to focus on making all schools worth choosing and remember how this system got to be in the first place and do our best to not perpetuate it.
Thank you so much for that essential context and history. And for those of you who are battling this issue with the state, you will quickly find that voucher advocates are not fond of revisiting that history. That's why it's so important that we know what it is. Myrna, I want to switch gears just a little bit and head over to you. There is a whole continuum of these programs that are before legislators right now. Some are big new programs, but a number of them are what we can see as the sort of incremental start down the private school choice pathway. And often they will make a point of centering the program around students with special needs. In order for us to understand what is the theme of this particular webinar, how programs that ostensibly serve these students can actually end up hurting them, we need you to kind of walk us through what the federal protections for students with special needs are, and how it is that private school voucher programs require students and parents to give up those protections.
Thanks, Jennifer. Great question. First of all, I would just say, to put it into context about students with disabilities, under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which is the federal special education law, several years ago, I'd say the 2018-19 school year, about 14% of the total school enrollment were students with disabilities who qualified for IDEA services, and less than 2% of students with disabilities were in private schools, what we refer to as parentally placed, put there by their parents and paid for either by their parents directly or through these voucher and other mechanisms. So for students with disabilities who qualify for services under the IDEA, there are certain very core basic rights. The first is what we refer to as FAPE, which is a free, appropriate public education. And notice the word public in there. And that involves the student receiving an individualized education program where a team of experts and the parents get together and decide what supports and services that student needs, most of whom, by the way, most students with disabilities are, for the most part, in the general education classroom, and these services and supports help them to meet the standards under the general education curriculum. So it's FAPE, a free, appropriate public education. It's also what we call the least restrictive environment. So a student with a disability, that team of folks, there's another team of folks, it's generally the same group of people, who decide where that student will receive those services. So as I said, the bulk of students with disabilities now are served in the general education classroom. In some situations, the student has more intensive needs and they're not able to provide those services. So they may pull that student out for some period of the day for more intensive services from various therapists, teachers, and so forth. Or in some very extreme cases, and it's a very small percentage, those students may be in segregated classrooms specifically for students with disabilities, usually very few students in the classroom with a good teacher to student ratio. And at the very, very far end of that continuum, and this is where sometimes people get confused about school choice has always been available for students with disabilities. In some very rare cases, students cannot be served in the public school and they may need a day program, a day treatment program, or even a residential program. All of that decided based on their unique individual needs. Then in those cases, the student is sent by the public school to those programs. And again, it's a free, appropriate public education. That child remains a student of the public school district, and the public school district pays for that child to be in that setting. And again, that is a very rare situation. The other thing that is very important to know about the rights of a student with disabilities is that under the IDEA, that student and their family have what we call due process protections. And so if the family feels that the services are not appropriate or adequate, they have a full array of recourse, if you will. They can start out with a due process hearing, including going on to court to challenge what the school district has provided, and the school district can also bring a suit. But it's very rare. There are other parts of that, such as mediation and less combative ways of dealing with problems than going to court, of course, where parents and school districts learn to communicate better with each other to try and find the best array of services for that student. So what happens in these voucher programs is, first of all, there are several of these programs, as Jennifer said, that are specifically directed to students with disabilities. One of the real problems is that parents are not informed that when they go and take this voucher or education savings account or whatever the mechanism is, that when they leave the public school district, they leave the protections, the rights, the free appropriate public education, and the least restrictive environment requirements behind. The individual private school can decide on its own that they're going to offer some of these things, but very few programs do. States have the option in their state programs to say all the protections of the IDEA will be in place. But what happens is very few schools, private schools, then will want to participate in the voucher program. I like to say when I'm discussing this, they're called private for a reason, because they're mission-driven schools, and they really want to be able to decide what kinds of students they will serve, and they only have the resources to serve certain students. Students with disabilities, generally we consider in the public school that it costs double to educate a student with a disability. And it costs, so there are funds involved from the federal government, which the private school is not going to receive through that voucher program. But most important, I think, what I really want to leave you with in this segment is that parents are ill-informed or not informed about what they are giving up. And once they go into that private school, they have no room to negotiate really or to challenge what the private school offers or can offer to their student. So I hope that helps give some context, Jennifer.
Thank you, Myrna. That was very clear. I feel much better informed having just listened to that. Erin, we're going to switch gears again and go to you. I recently saw an ad campaign from Florida, and we have some folks in Florida who are watching. The ad campaign was about how much LGBTQ kids are benefiting from Florida's now close to $1 billion private school choice program. As I watched that, I thought, this could really benefit from that voiceover that they do with pharmaceutical ads, where they run through all the side effects at a fast speed. I want you to run us through some of the side effects that you're seeing LGBTQ students encounter as they enter into this brave new world of private school choice.
Well, thank you, Jennifer. I appreciate the question, and would start by saying we're a national organization with 44 state and local chapters across the country that work in collaboration with others who are trying to defeat these really harmful bills and mitigate the effects of various private school programs across the country. We've been around for about 30 years, worked directly with students, family, and educators. For 20 years, we've conducted a national school climate survey where we asked LGBTQ plus students directly about their experiences in schools. Through that process, through all of that learning, we've identified 4 key supports. When schools have policies that not only remove barriers to educational opportunity that are caused by discrimination, bullying, and harassment, but that also affirm and make it more likely for students to thrive and reach their full potential, LGBTQ plus students and all students do better. When a school has inclusive curriculum, I think there's a lot of education folks on here are familiar with the theory of windows and mirrors. When students can see themselves in the classroom and their peers can get a little bit more insight on LGBTQ plus students, they're likely to do much better. When students are able to participate in gay straight alliances or gender and sexuality alliances, peer-to-peer support groups, they're more likely to thrive and reach their full potential. And when there are supportive educators, even one in a building, it makes all the difference to long-term educational attainment and well-being. And so what we've noticed after sort of identifying these 4 key areas that make schools not only safer, but affirming and promoting these long-term outcomes that we'd like to see, is that LGBTQ plus students most often experience the greatest harms, barriers to educational opportunity and well-being in private religious schools. There's a couple different ways that this looks. Being taught curriculum that is denigrating, not being able to use their pronouns, their names, being restricted from fully participating in athletics, PE, school dances. There's a very long list. And if you look at the experiences of these LGBTQ plus students attending private religious schools, LGBTQ plus students who are also Black, Indigenous, people of color, are more likely to experience racially discriminatory dress code policies. LGBTQ plus students who are also people with disabilities, listening to all the great information that Myrna shared with us, really experience multiple intersecting harms. So for us, for the last 30 years, we've been really focused, done a lot of work with our chapters in Florida and across the country to help tell the story, draw a bright line between the history of private school programs, whether they're vouchers, scholarships, et cetera, and the experiences of students, and really focusing on making sure that these funds, a recent study was conducted that found that 3/4 of schools funded by taxpayer subsidized private school programs are religious, where we're seeing these issues come up year after year, decade after decade. So really in Florida and across the country, making sure that these bills don't pass, that policymakers say no to taxpayer-funded discrimination, and that we're really within this conversation, within the twin pandemics of COVID-19 and systemic racism, taking a hard look at how we're allocating emergency relief dollars, whether at the federal, state, or local level, and making sure that public schools receive truly adequate funding and that those funds are going to where there's the greatest need.
Thank you so much for that, Erin. I'm really appreciating that people are talking about not just the potential dangers with private school voucher programs, but also the things that our public schools need to do better and pointing the way to resources that could help them do that. So Titilayo, another question for you. We just heard from Myrna and Erin pretty vivid examples about how choice programs that are being sold to help students with some of the greatest needs are really falling short. I want you to talk a little bit more about the illusion of choice, as you put it.
Yeah, absolutely. So the illusion of choice, there are really two ways that costs come into this entire conversation. One of the ways is to really get clear on the impact that vouchers have on school budgets. And then the second way is to really understand what vouchers do or don't buy you in a real life context. So I'll just say a little bit on the first and then jump to the second. There are some proponents of vouchers who argue that vouchers are revenue neutral, that there won't be as much of an effect, but those arguments fail to acknowledge that when schools lose students, they still have existing fixed costs, right? You don't lose students and then you just change the number of seats on a bus. You don't lose students and then you get to reduce your infrastructure. There's still a level of fixed costs that schools have to incur given what they have. And so, and that's even more of a challenge when you look at rural areas. We represent the 17 southern states in the South. When you look at rural areas who rely even more on state funding for their schools. So that's one thing to just keep in mind, that there are sort of real costs associated with education, and it can have impact on budgets, which is especially important. As Erin mentioned, this dual pandemic we're in, state budgets are taking hits because of it. So we really want to keep that in mind. But back to your comment on, or your reference to my earlier comment on that illusion of choice, because you do hear some people, and it's often very much from the parent perspective, which I want to flag, right? Oftentimes proponents of vouchers are speaking from the perspective that parents need to have a choice, right, of where their children go. And so I just want to sort of engage with that for a second and really talk about what that could look like. The fact of the matter is, when you look at vouchers and you look at the amounts that they offer, and they vary in different contexts and different states have different rules, they actually don't provide as much choice as people believe that they do. Except for a few instances where it's really enough to make the difference. The cost of private tuition is far above what those vouchers can cover. So let's just take a really practical example. So we're based here in Atlanta, Georgia. When you look at the Atlanta public schools, 68% of our students qualify for free and reduced price lunch. That means they're from families. If it was a family of three, their family income is anywhere from $22,000 to $26,000 a year. That's about $1,800 or $2,100 a month, right? When you look at the average amount of vouchers, when you see these rolled out in states, it's around, the 5,000-ish mark, right? And there's a range in there. When you look at the actual cost of private school tuition, so if you just look at staying with Atlanta for a second, elementary school on average is $10,000. High schools on average are $20,000 a year for private school tuition. And this isn't also keeping in mind some of the other costs that come into play, as Myrna said, when you're working with students who have special needs. So the actual cost or the actual sort of subsidy that vouchers provide, when you look at families who really need them and who many advocate that these are a great idea for, even with that voucher, they would not be able to cover the cost of sending their child to a private school. So what happens as a result is that you see many families who are of higher incomes. The income requirements vary across the states, who are taking advantage of these, and those who, and they probably may have sent their kids to private school anyway, but it's a discount in some cases. And then you have those families who are from lower income backgrounds who just would never have been able to afford private school anyway, and the vouchers don't give them that. So there are many who argue that, well, you do have some families, right, who would be able to, take that voucher and maybe go to a private school that they, really want to attend, and it would cover some of it. But I want us to also just keep intersections in mind. And these arguments can sometimes happen from very thoughtful leaders who are speaking on behalf of these communities. What we have to not forget is the class component of this and how it intersects with race, and how you can, we don't want to be legislating and making policy in ways that affect that broader population of students who are the new majority of our public schools. Again, I said of those 50 million students, half of them are students from low-income backgrounds. Half of them are students of color who wouldn't be able to use these vouchers to get to these schools anyway. So in many different ways, it's a better investment and it's a more sensible policy decision to direct resources towards public schools and to make sure that they have what they need. And we can just, in many ways, dispense with that argument that vouchers are even really buying choice. Choice is the case when you can actually use it and choose it. And what we can focus our attention on instead is creating a public system where we have quality choices. And polling data show that that's actually what parents want. They want a quality public school that they can send their kids to. And when they're told and when they're polled, and we've seen a positive thing that we've seen with a lot of ballot measures for vouchers, we've seen them not pass in a lot of places. So this is a good thing, because when the public really understands that it's taking resources out of public schools and directing them into private schools, overwhelmingly, they aren't in support of that. So I think it's clear, it's important for us to get really clear on both the budget impact of vouchers and also the practical, everyday, like dinner table implications of what that even gets you, given what we know about income and cost of living, and not even to mention the distance that one might have to travel to get to a private school if you're in a rural community. So is that even really choice for you when you don't have one there? I think that's a conversation that, and all of that energy and those resources could really be directed to what everyone wants, which is a high quality public school system.
Myrna, the justification that we're hearing from legislators in state after state is that it's the school closures that really have, made clear the dramatic need for these private school choice programs, even in states where schools are largely open. And it is often parents of kids with special needs who are invoked as the kind of, living representation of how badly the public schools fell down on the job. I wondered what you might say if you had the opportunity to respond to that kind of argument, or if you've heard anyone else push back in a way that we might learn from.
Well, first of all, I was remiss in not saying that my organization, the Council of Administrators of Special Education, are the individuals in each of the school districts around the country who are responsible for providing special education to students with disabilities. So of course, this question is one that is a sensitive question for my members. I believe that, school closure, this pandemic situation has just, we've all been disrupted, if you will. Our lives have been disrupted, students' lives have been disrupted. And I think some of the argument around students with disabilities is that some of them get one-on-one services, not that many again. Some of them do get, they get speech language services, they get occupational therapy, physical therapy, services from the school social worker, all of these various services in addition to specialized instruction, which is what special education really is. And I think, the issue again is that all children have had to rethink, and all families have had to rethink what education looks like. It's interesting, I'm actually a consultant, so in addition to CASE, one of the groups that I work with are the occupational therapists, for example. And they've had amazing success during this whole rejiggering of education, if you will. They've dropped off to parents, to families, manipulatives for small children, parents actually who never really knew exactly what OT or PT or some of these therapies were, have been sitting with their children and experiencing what the children are doing and learning more about the therapies that are actually assisting their children to be successful in school. And overall, I think actually it has been an amazing experience in learning about different ways to deliver education. Teletherapy has become much more ingrained, and people are talking now about the fact that, let's say, for example, in rural communities that may not have access to some of these therapists, where there are shortages in these professions, that now we will have access to be able to provide services to students with disabilities and other services who may have been shortchanged, if you will, along the way. I'm not saying we want to be in a pandemic, but I'm saying there are lessons to be learned. The other thing I would say, and this is something that CASE has been talking about since the very beginning, we've put on numerous webinars for our members about how to make sure that services are delivered appropriately, that special education, the federal law was not designed to be delivered or implemented in a pandemic. No education law was. And so we've all sort of stumbled along, and I think amazingly have found some solid ground as we've gone through this experience. And I really actually have become very sensitive when people say that students with disabilities have been shortchanged. I'm not saying there aren't students who haven't gotten services. The other thing that I think has been interesting, and I'll just end with this comment, is that because there's been such pressure on the issue around students with disabilities, some school districts have decided early on to bring those children back into the schools when other children were not there. And I think, from my organization and from some other disability groups, we have really tried to reinforce the idea that in a pandemic, safety and health concerns are paramount. And, we did not want to endanger children in any way, or the faculty, the staff that had to work with them. So school districts have had to make some very serious decisions around bringing kids back into the schools earlier than perhaps some of the health folks might have said was sensible. So, I think it's a mixed bag as always, but I think under the circumstances, children have been quite well served.
Thanks for that, and for sharing your multiple perspectives. That was really useful. Erin, I want to go back to you. One of the things that we're seeing is that a number of these big programs are actually tax credits, right? And that companies get substantial tax benefits for donating. And the issue that's arisen in states like Florida, I know you're in many other states, but this is a big issue in Florida, is that you have companies that are essentially underwriting these curricula and schools that turn out to be really discriminatory. This has become an explosive issue. I'm wondering if you're seeing this play out other places around the country, and how we might do a better job of really showcasing what seems to be such a tension.
Well, certainly appreciate that. And, we have been focused on this issue. It's been a big issue of concern for us for the past 30 years. There's been some additional movement in the past couple of years, different sort of mutations of the same idea. And I think, drawing back to that historical perspective, we're looking at something new, but it is also exactly the same. So I think it's really important for us as education advocates to stay focused on the things that really work in public education, in public schools, and to the extent that we need to broaden our public education campaign to folks who are outside of government and outside of K-12 learning communities who are wanting to invest in this way. I think that's something to take a look at. In terms of whose voice should be centered in all of these conversations, we've really focused our efforts and our work, regardless of who we're talking to, by lifting up the experiences of students, families, and educators. And I think, we've gotten to so many different places, whether it's talking to a governor's office, to a company, to a school district administrator, that really gets a better shared understanding of what is working and what is not working in our K-12 learning communities when those students, families, and educators are in the room and can talk directly with folks who are making decisions. So I would say, again, whether it's Florida, whether it's in any of these other states, really connecting whoever is making a decision on what happens in schools that impacts students is in the room.
Thank you so much for that important reminder. I know we're going to pivot before too long and do some questions from the viewers, but I actually have two more questions I'm hoping to squeeze in. And the first is for Titilayo. Unfortunately, there are a number of states where it seems very likely that these programs will be, new programs will be enacted, or there will be big expansions. I know you've been spending some time with your colleagues thinking about the kinds of guardrails that we might insist on implementing in order to keep these programs from doing the most damage. Can you just quickly walk us through some of those?
Yeah, absolutely. So we work in the southern states, and when you look at where these laws are passed or looking to be passed, we have to contend with this quite a bit. So by playing both defense and offense, one of the things we think about is how can the existing laws on the books be less harmful? Going back to our point earlier about choice and real choice, one of the things that will make it possible for parents to make the best decisions for their children is to have private schools who are receiving public dollars be more transparent and accountable. So if you're going to have choice, parents need to understand sort of basic sets of information that private schools are not required to disclose. And so we think that there are a couple of policy solutions that can be advanced in those contexts where those policies, where voucher policies exist, to make them more transparent and make them more accountable and make them truly on equal footing with public schools if that's what they're choosing to do. Ideally, we'd like to see these phase out over time. We'd also like to see income requirements change, because the result, depending on where the income requirement is set, could result in what I was discussing earlier, where you have the take up happening from families of higher incomes, and it's truly sort of subsidizing the wealthy to go to private schools. So those are some things that we are doing or thinking about in places where these policies already exist. Ideally, we just don't want to see them proliferate further. And so we work very hard to make sure that they don't. But that transparency and accountability point is incredibly important, because in many schools, private schools are private, as Myrna said, and they're operating in a black box, and it's really hard to know, what's happening, and for parents to make decisions. And I think that if we allow for that kind of transparency and accountability, we can really make sure that some of the things that we're concerned about are being addressed, and schools are sort of required to not just take the public money, but also be accountable to the public in terms of what's happening within those schools.
Elise, I actually have a question for you. I can imagine as Titilayo is talking that people in blue states might be sitting back and thinking, oh, we don't really need to worry about this. This is only something that the red states are dealing with. But you're also an expert in the legal context and the shifting legal context. And you mentioned in your intro the Espinoza case in Montana. I wondered if you could just give us a sense of what's on the legal horizon. How is the sort of shift in the way that we think about the separation between church and state? And by we, I'm talking about the Supreme Court. Like, what are you worried about, and how can we be better prepared to deal with the next onslaught?
Sure, thank you for that question. And I know I gave a little bit of intro talking about the Espinoza decision, and that really being the genesis of our idea for creating this toolkit, because we know that there are a lot of questions about there on what does this case mean? What does this portend for our state? And so I'm happy to talk about that a little bit more. I just want to step back briefly and I know we've talked about this, and Aaron has mentioned it a lot in talking about how religious schools are the primary beneficiaries of voucher programs, and about how the discrimination and the civil rights protections are really especially lacking in those schools. And so I just want to think about it more broadly in terms of discrimination that takes place in religious schools. For example, we've talked about this a little bit, but religious schools, when they accept vouchers, they often have explicit exemptions from civil rights protections. They are often exempt from federal, state, local non-discrimination provisions. And while this is acceptable when private schools are funded by their congregants or private donors, even when they are taking these public dollars in the form of vouchers, they are still engaging in discrimination. They are still, in many cases, exempt from these non-discrimination protections. And this really flies in the face of a principle that we think should be pretty universal, which is that when you're receiving federal funds or state funds, when you're receiving public dollars through these voucher programs, there should be strings attached to those to that funding, right? So voucher proponents argue that these religious schools should be able to maintain their autonomy simply because they're religious, in essence, that they shouldn't have to abide by any of the same oversight or regulations or non-discrimination protections that apply to these other schools. And this is really a way of saying that they want to have their cake and eat it too. They want to have it both ways. They want to be able to get this government funding, but they also want to be able to engage in discrimination and not have to change any of their policies. Policies that we've mentioned might include, just saying, you're of the wrong faith, we're not going to accept you as a student at our school, or you have to sign a statement of faith or sign a contract saying that you're going to abide by certain principles. And if you are LGBTQ, or your parents are unmarried, these are all reasons that these private religious schools don't accept kids. And so it's an interesting sort of flipping of this idea of discrimination. These schools taking public funds, engaging in discrimination, and yet they turn around and say that if they aren't eligible for the same funding as these other schools, that is a form of discrimination against religious schools based on their religion. And unfortunately, the Supreme Court has largely agreed with this position. So if we go back to the decision this last summer in the Espinoza versus Montana Department of Revenue case, the court held that the state of Montana could not fund a voucher program that was limited only to secular schools. And this came about because Montana passed a tuition tax credit program there. And Montana has, like many other states, I believe 47 states across the country, have some sort of constitutional provision that says that there can be no public funding of religious education. Montana has one of these no aid provisions. And so Montana said, to put our program in line with our constitutional provision, we are going to limit our tuition tax credit program, our voucher program, only to secular schools. This was challenged, and the Supreme Court said that, in fact, Montana couldn't do this, that Montana, if they were going to create a private school voucher program, they had to allow religious schools to be eligible for funding in the same way as secular private schools. The Supreme Court's reasoning was that the Free Exercise Clause prohibits states from discriminating against religious institutions based on their religious status, which it distinguished from a religious use, saying that simply by the fact that a school is religious, you can't discriminate against that school. You can't say that they're not eligible for funding in the same way way that private secular schools are. One thing about this decision is that while it does undermine states, as I mentioned, the majority of states have these same constitutional provisions, while it does limit their ability to prohibit public funding of religious schools, this decision did leave the door open just a little bit by distinguishing really based on status, religious status and religious use. There might be ways for states to say, this funding is going towards religious use, which, we would argue that religious education is definitely a religious use. So there might be ways to limit funding of religious institutions that way. The court also didn't talk about whether states can still limit funding that goes towards discrimination. As we've talked about, so many of these schools engage in discrimination. So that might be another way for states to try to prevent funding of these private schools that discriminate against students. But the case really was a huge blow to the separation of church and state and to the constitutional no-aid provisions that really have been a bar in a lot of states from enacting private school voucher programs there, or have really been the basis of challenge for a lot of these programs across the state. So, because of this decision last summer, I think we rightly assumed that there would be a surge in voucher legislation moving in the states this year, really proponents being, motivated by this decision, being emboldened by this decision to say that they now have free rein to push for voucher programs. Of course, we don't think that's exactly what the case means, but I think it certainly has led to an uptick in voucher bills across the states.
We've got a fair number of questions coming in, and I've been mulling them over and have thoughtfully selected each of you to address them. So Titilayo, this one is going to go to you. Bill wants to know if there is evidence coming out about vouchers resegregating schools. He's especially interested in Florida. So I'm curious if you know about that. And if maybe you could talk a little bit about the kinds of schools that we see kids ending up at, because I think so often the image that we get is of an elite private school when we hear that name, when the reality on the ground might be quite a bit different.
Yeah, so I think there are 128 private schools in the metro Atlanta area, right? And they range from the more elite private schools to smaller schools that might be, no more than 50 students or so so there's a lot of variation within there. The research on segregation is mixed. For some of the transparency reasons I alluded to before, just data in general on what's happening in private schools can be really hard to get a hold of, but you can look at what's happening in the public schools. And when you just do the math, right? So if you just take, for example, your average, public school in an area that is majority students of color. And people may know that our schools in many ways are more segregated than they used to be. So if you take that and you say a couple of students of color are able to go to a private school, many of which are predominantly white, there would have to be a lot of balancing there, to really make a difference. And what you see from the take up of vouchers is many white wealthy families going to private schools, and it looks more like the white flight that we've seen before. So there's more research to be done on this, but when you look at the impact on public schools, for sure, it sort of leads to more of what we see in a lot of places, which is sort of the concentration of students of color and students from lower income backgrounds. And we just have to query whether we as a country believe that it's important to have students of many backgrounds being educated together, right? So beyond race, but also gender affiliation, sex, orientation, religion. We need to think about whether or not that's a value of ours. And I think it is. And I think it's important for us to build a thriving economy and democracy where people are educated together and know how to work together and build together. And what we were just seeing from the take up, at least of vouchers, mostly because of some of the cost things that I mentioned earlier, you're seeing a lot of economic segregation and racial segregation continue as well.
Thank you. That was really helpful. Erin, I'm going to pose this next question to you. Conrad was very intrigued by my reference to corporate money going into Florida's huge tax credit scholarship program and wants to know a little bit more about how that works. I'm curious about whether that's something that you can talk about, or why would a company be attracted to a program like this?
Well, I have to say, it is interesting how these bills and these proposals have changed over time and how they're different from year to year. And we see different actors from different sectors who try and advance a particular agenda. Um, I'm probably not the expert on, outlining exactly what these these investments are for, or perhaps even how to influence them. But I would just go back again to really focusing on what we want and what works in K-12 learning communities. Safer schools, all schools meeting their civil rights obligations and having truly adequate funding to serve our students, families, and educators.
I think that's a really important point. And whenever I hear about businesses that are donating to these scholarship programs because they're being sold on the idea that this is the way to uplift students in need, I wish that there were more voices echoing what you just said. We've got another question that I'm going to pose to Myrna. So one of the things that public ed advocates are feeling so frustrated by in this busy legislative season is that the really, the incredibly well-funded publicity effort behind voucher expansion just says over and over again that these programs work. And they will often point to parents who are now very satisfied, including parents of kids with special needs. How should folks respond to the claims that voucher programs work?
Well, I mean, we can't categorically say that every parent is not satisfied. I mean, there are going to be some people who are perfectly fine with the program. I think for students with disabilities, as I tried to explain earlier, part of the problem, and I think Titilayo has, talked about this a bit too, is what the real choice is that parents have. While you may hear a few isolated stories, and this is a country where we legislate by anecdote, so that makes it really kind of dangerous with the public relations piece. But when you look at these programs, and you realize that, you give a voucher to a parent of a child with a disability, and then they start shopping around, which is really what I call it. They have to shop around to these different schools to find out which ones will take them. They realize that their choice is actually quite limited, that there are only a few schools. And of course, depending on the community, there may be no schools that will actually take a child with a disability. It's not because they don't like children with disabilities. They don't have the resources. They don't have the staff. Another thing I didn't mention earlier is a lot of private schools are not required to have qualified educators. That is, that they don't have to meet the state teacher credentials and so forth. And for special education, there are additional credentialing pieces that they would have to teach students with disabilities. So I think, to counter the public relations, we can't say that there are no schools ever that are going to provide a good education with a voucher, but I think that they are very limited. And I think for parents with disabilities, this also goes back to the piece of them not being given the adequate information they need when they take these vouchers. One thing we've also seen happen, and this happened early on with the McKay Scholarship in Florida, and I have not been able to track down any statistics recently, but there were parents who were very excited about that program, which was the first one specifically for students with disabilities. And parents took that, and then they got to these schools where they were allowed to bring their children and found that the child did not get what was on their individualized education program. And now they were withdrawing their children and bringing them back to the public schools. Those voucher dollars stayed in those private schools, so the public school had less money, and now they're re-entering and they have to start the process almost all over in some schools to get those services in place. So I think it's really a matter, public relations is wonderful, but really giving people information is one of the pieces that's really lacking in these programs.
So we have just a minute left, and I'm going to put Titilayo on the spot one last time. I revealed how complex all this stuff is by putting Aaron on the spot about trying to get him to explain how neo vouchers work in Florida, you threw out references to education savings accounts and a whole other array of programs. I'm wondering if you can just walk us through how something like a neo voucher works.
Yeah, so just to loop back to Conrad's question, the voucher program there does, in reference to like, why would corporations ever do this? Maybe they're benevolent, maybe they just want the tax credits, right? So they get a credit on their corporate taxes and on their insurance premiums if they donate to these programs. Now, there has been some pushback, like publicly, where people realize that that's happening and that these resources are funding, anti-LGBTQ schools, for example. There in Florida, there was pushback with one of the major banks who was making those donations. I believe it was Fifth Third Bank. And there was pushback, so then they flip-flop back and forth a little bit. And so that definitely does happen. And it's so I hope that answers Conrad's question. And I hope that was the question you were asking me to loop back and sort of add a little bit to what that looks like. I think the essential thing, which is how Lee set it up, public funds, private schools, right? You look for that, you got the version of, some version of what's happening here. And it's just not good for kids. It's not good for our sort of overall endeavor of what Aaron and everyone has been saying, which is we need those resources in public schools because it's in everyone's interest to have public schools be strong and serve those students who are our, new majority here in the country.
Elise, I'm going to hand it back over to you. We've got some other questions that relate specifically to issues that I know are addressed in your excellent materials. So I'm hoping you'll give another shout out for that.
Sure. Yes, I've seen several questions in the chat about studies and providing rebuttals to a lot of these arguments that I know we've just brought up, especially Jennifer has just brought up about this illusion of choice and, just a lot of these arguments that we see about parent satisfaction, things like that. Those are all rebutted in our talking points that are included in the toolkit. And I'll post the link again to that in the chat so everyone can access it really easily. Let me do that right now. But safe to say, if there is something, if there are more resources that you're looking for, please do check out the NCPE website. This is probably a great time to shift into our closing, actually, because I have a slide that has more information where you can find it. Let me go ahead and access that. 1 second. So everyone on this panel has graciously agreed to share their contact information here. You can also, as I mentioned, check out the NCPE Coalition website. We have links to news and articles and studies and talking points. And we have write-ups of legislation that's moving at the federal level. We have pretty much any resource you could ever want. Of course, the toolkit is there. So we hope that you will find that to be a useful resource. And there's also a way to contact us as well on the NCPE website. So we hope that if this webinar sparks an interest in learning more about voucher programs, in particular, a certain angle, that you feel free to reach out and contact us, because we really want to be a resource and help all of you that are working so hard on this issue and supporting our public schools and fighting back against voucher programs, that we hope we can be a resource to you. So with that, I just again want to thank all of our panelists today and Jennifer as our moderator. It has been such a wonderful conversation. I want to thank everyone who's joined us today, either via Zoom or on Facebook Live. It was great to have this conversation, and we hope that you will stay plugged in and check out u.org and ncpe.org and reach out to our panelists as well. So thank you very much.